mean, if we're being honest, Doc Seismic isn't wrong. The Washington Monument is essentially just, United States' penis. Either that or Florida. Take your pick. Hello, interwebs! I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of Invincible Season 2. This time, Episode 2, in about 6 hours, I will lose my virginity to a fish. Yes, that's actually the title of the episode. That wasn't just a weird non sequitur that I just did. I definitely did not lose my virginity to a fish. Anywho, let's get into the review, and as per usual, even though I have read the comics, I will not be spoiling any of the comic storylines that are going to be coming up, though I may mention some comparisons to the comic with ongoing storylines that we see in this episode, and I'll also start off mainly spoiler-free for the episode, but I will slowly get into spoilers as the video gets along. So, what did I think about this episode overall? I thought this was another very good episode, but also another slow burn, which I'm feeling a little bit more than I did in the premiere. I mean, if any of you watched my review of last week's episode, which you all should have, looking at you. But if you watched my review of the premiere, I did say I was really excited for this sort of more character-focused episode, but was hoping that season 2, or episode 2 I should say, we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty plot and start moving things forward. And it's kind of a difficult moment because, again, having read the comics, I know that this section of the comics is very much a sort of calm before larger plot things that come down the line. I mean, there was the big stuff with Omni-Man and the revelation there, and then there's sort of this section of the comics where it's really much more episodic, especially for a comic series, which is issue by issue, where Mark's sort of figuring himself out, and that's kind of where we're at now. And so the comics are meant to be more of that kind of character building feel, but I am starting to feel it a little bit, especially in this episode where it is sort of a little bit more of Mark trying to figure out whether or not he will become his father. But I do like that we get to see much more of a character growth for him from last episode, where he was very much more unsure of himself, trying to figure out whether he's going to grow into his father or not. This episode, he does seem to have been grown in his confidence that he's not going to be like his father, but there's still a little of that in him. But we do get to see him starting to have more positive relationships and more ties to the human beings around him, specifically Amber, who is also just much... I know this is the controversial statement considering the racist assholes that are out there, but Amber is much better here for the most part in my mind, and I just really like seeing their healthy relationship grow, and Mark like bringing her to Vegas, and there's just the fun little nuances of a human and superhero / alien relationship where he's like, I couldn't take you to Paris because I would flay your skin off, and Amber just like kind of jokingly making that flirting in a way that teenagers do. So I thought all of that was really well portrayed, especially getting into Mark trying to balance his human and superhero life in a way that doesn't fall into the old tropes as easily, where you would see a lot of entropy storytelling with superheroes that, like, Mark's friends would be very upset or bothered by him not being there, and he would sort of have to rest like, I have to balance a normal life and a not normal life, and actually that isn't really the case here. His friends are rather supportive, especially Amber, who kind of gets it. We kind of got a little bit of that in season 1 with Amber, but here, it's everyone sort of like, now that the secret's out, they're like, yeah, we understand, we get it, we're supportive of you, and we want you to be there. But Mark's sort of putting the responsibility on himself to constantly be out there, constantly always do these things, and he feels the pressure that I think a lot of like kids of his age feel of like, I need to be the adult, I need to take care of my family or my friends or people around. He just has much more responsibility than he should be at his age, and that being felt on Mark's mother, Deborah, who is trying to be his mother in these moments, and I really love her writing here because she's trying to be his mother and she's doing a decent job, but she's missing small things, like saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, or it's just a tiny thing that just keeps building up with her, and she's trying her best, and yet her best is also trying to deal with all the shit that she has to emotionally deal with on her own, dealing with Omni-Man. And so there's just this great balance with her trying to be the mother to Mark that he needs, but also just dealing with her own stuff and trying to go and confront Cecil, trying to push Mark to be a kid, and yet he's not really listening because he knows he feels that responsibility, and he doesn't respect her as much at this point. And that's not to say he doesn't love her or care for her, he views her less than, but he's just sort of like, I have the weight of the world on my shoulders, and you're dealing with stuff. And that moment that hurts him when she does sort of break down at that one moment at the end there and sort of pushes Mark away for a second, but then still accepting his help. It shows their difficult relationship at this moment, and it's not over the top as it was in the comics, but still feels like it's along the same path as the comics, and I really, really enjoy that. And that comes along with Adam Eve, who I also really liked in this episode. I mean, we got to see a lot more of her in the special they released between season 1 and season 2 that gave us her origin story, and the really fucked up relationship she has with her parents, and yet still seeing them as, you know, her parents to a degree, despite the complicatedness of her origin story, and her father being this like guy who is very much like, you know, I gotta control everything, I have to be the man in the house, this like toxic masculinity bullshit. And yet Till's touching on like a grain of her own insecurity when he says like, you're dangerous as a superhero. Like we saw that in her origin story, and we see that coming out here where she does try to help people, but it causing problems and leading to people getting hurt potentially. So with the park. So I just love the drawing out of that arc where there's nuance there. He's clearly an asshole, her father is, and yet he does touch upon her insecurities in a very specific way that gets to her, that I really enjoyed. Oh, also, something I should say that I forgot to mention in the first episode of the season is I like the change of the Invincible logo coming at the end of every episode, and also being more blood red, and then slowly shifting to, I believe, the original colors that it was in the first episode of the show. So I'm liking that sort of reversal that we get here of like Invincible trying to find himself through what his father did to him. It's a nice just visual reference to his character arc. We also get in this episode the Martian character from last season who comes to Earth and decides to be his own Mr. Martian superhero here, a stretch man or something like that. And I thought this was a fun little bit of comedic relief throughout the episode. Didn't knock my socks off, but I did enjoy this character who was like kind of bumbling, pretending to be human, a little bit over the top. I do think that his meeting the Guardians was a little bit easy in terms of them just instantly bringing them back to their headquarters. It's sort of like, you're gonna trust this person that you meet out of nowhere and bring him back to your headquarters when last time you did that with Omni-Man, he murdered a whole bunch of people. It just felt a little quick and a little trusting for him, especially since they don't know anything about him and they even draw attention to that fact. So I didn't really love that. And then also, for me, I've read the comics, so I kind of knew what was happening, but just the way the part was intercut with us seeing what was going on Mars and these sort of Starro-like aliens taking over people and coming towards Earth, along with this guy's backstory, his fake backstory, it could imply that this Martian guy is that's his backstory, but I don't, like, if I'm remembering from the comics correctly, that's like just something that's happening concurrently to this story. So it's just, the editing choice on that was really weird because it seems to imply that it is that Martian's backstory, that he is like have something to do with these Starro aliens, when in reality that's just something happened concurrently to his homeworld on Mars. So it was just, I think, again, I would have been confused had I not read the comics. So I'm curious if other people got that vibe as well. Just kind of a strange editing choice in there. Also, we see a little bit of Duplicate and the Immortal getting together, along with like Rexplode sort of being pushed out to the side because of him cheating on her last season, I believe. And this was always something that I'm curious to see where they're going to go with this in the comics, because Duplicate, I believe, is over 18, but she is definitely younger than the Immortal, and they don't really address that in the book, in the comic as well. It's like, they're like the Immortal side of it, where he's like, I've lived forever, I have to form relationships with people, Duplicate someone, I'm forming a relationship, does come up in the comics, but the age difference is still, it's still weird. And I mean, there's like technically no age difference is going to be not weird with the Immortal, who is like hundreds of years old, but there is like, he looks like a 40, 50-year-old dude, and to my memory, Duplicate's like 18, 20. It's just, it's a little weird, and the comics don't really bring it up in a way that addresses the strangeness of it outside of like a superhero context. And I'm curious if the show is going to, because it's just something that's like, I guess it doesn't need to, and it's not like it's technically overtly wrong. They're both still technically adults, and, you know, I'm someone who's just like, you know, if you're both adults, the age difference is weird, certainly, and there can be elements of, you know, taking advantage of that, but it's also not necessarily always my place in that way. But there is sort of like a thing that I would like the show to be a little bit more able to talk about. I'm not saying it shouldn't have that relationship at all. I think it's actually something interesting to discuss. I just hope it discusses it. So I'll sort of keep an eye and track that. We also got to meet a character that I always found interesting in the comics, Darkwing, and his introduction here is pretty much exactly as it is from the comics, where we get that sort of dark world. I always love dark world, like things hiding in the darkness, like monsters and stuff, so that was interesting. So it was an interesting introduction to that character in this episode. I will say it's almost even a little bit more rushed than it is in the comic. I think he has a little bit more room to breathe there than it does here, which is not often the case with this show. I've often found the show has been more willing to give space to things that didn't have as much space in the comics, so that was interesting, but it effectively works regardless. So yeah, it was just nice to meet him. I also liked that we get to see Midnight City, this sort of like clear delineation between night and brightness. It was just a fun little moment that I always, very Dark City vibes to me that I really kind of enjoyed, even though we only got to see it briefly. I also enjoyed the Atlantean section. It was even more creepy in the comics, if I remember correctly. But again, just a good character moment for Mark where he goes in and saves everybody, and it really proves that he is a superhero. He's willing to go and try his best to put his life on the line and protect others. I thought was all very good. And then we end the episode off with Angstrom Levy going around and meeting other Marks from different universes and learning their potential weaknesses. So that is a nice little stinger at the end there, sort of building up Angstrom as the sort of main bad for the season so far, which I was curious about because there's, you know, the show is known to move things around in the comics, so I'm curious what they were building to specifically with this season in terms of the ongoing storyline. And it seems like Angstrom is going to be that thread that they pull on more specifically. So I'm curious to see what's going to come up. But again, no spoilers from the comics from me. But I will be curious in keeping an eye on where they are going. So that wraps up pretty much my review of this episode. Overall, I liked it, but I am starting to feel the slow burn a little bit more than I did in episode 1. We'll sort of see where episode 3 picks up. It's by no means bad. Everything here is great, but the pace, the slower pace, you know, it is starting to not necessarily be bad, but I am starting to notice it a little bit more than I often do. So I'm curious to see if episode 3 will pick it up a little bit more, or if we'll stay at this pace going further into the back half of this part of the season, because they're splitting up in, I guess I didn't realize this, but there's a part, 1 that they're releasing with 4 episodes, and then we're going to get the other 4 episodes next year, evidently. So we'll see where that eventually goes. But that's my thoughts on this episode. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below, but beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.